Hi, Rena.
Hello, Dr. Bach.
The title we have is Will Suffering Make You a Better Person? And I feel like I want to focus on the a better person part to begin with. Um, I think a lot of people nowadays don't think a lot about morality or being a good person in the moral sense. It's not, it doesn't come into their consciousness too much. It tends to come in as a side thing, like, well, I don't murder people. I don't rape people. I don't kidnap children and hold them in my basement. So I'm good on the moral front. And now I'm just here to pursue my happiness, get my career going, get my relationships going. But the idea of developing morally and being a morally good person is not at the forefront of, I think, of many people's minds. I think they think, well, I'm just living my life. And some people may pursue a moral path and they associate that with unselfishness. They may want to become monks or priests or save the whales or save the environment, save the poor, save everyone, help people, donate your organs, give your money out. I'm not into that. I'm just into living my life, pursuing my happiness. I don't think too much about morality. And I think that our title, Will Suffering Make You a Better Person? I think as we talk about this, a better person will that term, a better person will constantly ping this issue of, do you mean better morally or do you mean pursuing your happiness? And of course my view is they're the same thing, and the right morality is the morality of selfishness. But for many people, they think morality means unselfishness, and many of these people who think that kind of regard morality as a side thing, a thorn in the side to worry about here and there, but then mainly I'm pursuing my happiness. That's my opening
Yeah,
thought. I'm not talking about suffering yet,
yeah,
but that thought of just what do we mean by better person is in the
yeah.
air. Yeah.
It's interesting because I think it depends on what you grew up in and the structures and whatnot that you grew up in, whether or not you think about morality or not. So I grew up in a subculture where that was like always on the table. Like becoming a moral person or a better person was there. And I think there's a reason there's a strong self-help movement. I don't think it's only to get out of pain or suffering, as we're going to talk about. But I also think that there is something in people that they want to be better people or the best versions of themselves. And so it's interesting that I think, yes, there's going to be a subset of people who it never crosses their mind. And then there's going to be a whole subset of people who it is on their mind, but it's coming possibly from like an outside source, right? That somebody else says these things, like you mentioned, okay, I don't kill, I don't steal, or whatever. Like, okay, we have certain ideas of okay, most of us agree on that,
Yeah.
and then there's other things that come in through religion, say, or other sources of, okay, this is what a better person looks like, and it's kind of dictated from above in some way. And then there's the really thinking about what is it for an individual to become a better person. And I actually think slightly different, not that people don't think about it, but if they do think about it, they don't know what it is that would um, equal being a better person. Like they don't have a target that they're necessarily aiming for that's super clear to them. And so I'd be inclined, from my experience, to go, oh, it's more about a lack of clarity of what that means. How would I know when I've achieved that? Versus people who don't think about, even though I think there is a whole subset of people who never think about the question.
I think I'm with you. I think I got the bulk of what you were saying. I think I'm with you. There's just here are some questions people may have as they live life. What will make me happy? Should I pursue my happiness or should I pursue something else? What does morality require? What will make me a better person? I kind of want to become a better person, or I'm curious about becoming a better person. Why should I become a better person? And is that the same thing as being a happier person, or are they two different things that are somewhat related, or are they enemies? So these are all questions that are just live much of the time across life, yeah, for many people.
Yeah, yeah. And and funny that, I kind of thought we'd be starting at suffering and
Yeah,
talking about
so did
that.
I.
Here
So
we
I'm sorry.
are. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's it's cool. Like here we are talking about, oh, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a better person? How do we assess that? How do we achieve that? Um, and like you said, is that akin to happiness and seeking happiness, or is there more to it?
I was going to begin where you thought I would begin by talking about suffering, and then I realized the second part of the title, a better person, is an important thing to. I felt like raising it. I think in most contexts, when people talk about is suffering valuable or not, they tend to assume that the goal is happiness, and what will make me the happiest. Should I embrace my suffering or avoid it? And they get into that debate, which we'll get into probably. And I wanted to raise that we could also ask, what does it mean to be a better person, and how does that relate to being a happy person? In addition to thinking about, will suffering make you a happier person in some in sense of suffering? Yeah. All right. So that kind of worms open. Did you want to go ahead if you had
Well,
something?
I was thinking, and maybe just to kind of add to that, like when I first thought of the question that you posed of does suffering will or can suffering make you a better person? My immediate answer, of course, was, well, it depends, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're a good person, it possibly could make you better. If you are, a person who's not a good person or evil person, it might make you worse, or it might just make you more of who you are. So even my immediate knee-jerk answer depends on the second part of the sentence, which is becoming a better person. So what I'm
Yeah.
saying is I get that we're starting here. Like that makes sense to me.
I Yes. So let me. I feel like I want to present the devil's advocate argument, a pro-suffering position that I don't agree with, but let me. So here's the thought. A lot of people are seeking happiness in the wrong way. They go for immediate gratification. They are self-centered. They just go with what their desires are, their wants are, and they want the path of ease. And this tends to make people lazy and ungrateful and entitled, and they're not appreciating that life is hard, success is hard, happiness is hard. So these people who want an easy life of immediate gratification, path of least resistance, they should take on suffering and take on burden and face their suffering. As people face their suffering, you hear things like, having a heart attack was the greatest thing that happened to me. Getting cancer was the greatest thing that happened to me. Having my heart broken was the greatest thing that happened to me, because I finally suffered, and and that was mud to lotus. I grew from that suffering. Or you hear that people who suffer in their work, in the military, in their pursuit of helping others, in their duties to their family, they have a higher, deeper form of happiness than people who just go for immediate hedonistic gratification. So many people who are unhappy and they're trying to find happiness and and they're failing at it, what they need to do is seek the value of suffering and turn to traditions that in some sense honor it, like Stoicism or Buddhism and Jordan Peterson, and just the ideas that would have you turn towards suffering as the means to true happiness. Yeah. I think, did I present? My goal was to present an essentialized thought that many people are influenced by nowadays. Yeah.
Yeah, what's hard is because there's a lot of
Yeah.
different thoughts in that,
Yeah.
including several different straw mans. So the question is, are we talking about turning towards, as you mentioned at the end, and pursuing suffering, or are we talking about what to do with suffering when it occurs? Because I think those are two very different, ideas to talk about.
Okay. Parents are annoyed with their kid for playing video games and watching porn all day and not going to school, not looking for work, and they want to kick their kid in the ass, go to military or go to school or go find work, get out of the house. You need to learn the value of suffering because this is not a good trend for you. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So in other words, that's using the idea of suffering as the excuse or the reason that somebody should pursue a better life,
I think
right? And we kind of, I mean, you know,
I'm spe- I'm speaking faster than I'm thinking, so I'm not even sure what I'm getting at as I speak. Just this, I'm doing like really organic intelligence free association conversation. That example came to mind in response to
right.
your question. Just the
Well,
parents
but I think
who
it's
want their kid to suffer, right?
right.
Yeah.
I think it's valuable in the sense that, and a valid question, right? Or example, I should say, that to try to motivate somebody with suffering, as in that example, the parents telling the kid, you need to go have some hard knocks in life so that
Yeah.
you grow up, encouraging suffering for the sake of helping somebody achieve becoming a better person or more moral person or even happy, that seems illogical to me in the sense that suffering is suffering. Suffering is painful. And there is no doubt that we, to get food, to get shelter, to get all the things that we need to acquire those things, that takes some kind of work. That takes some kind of effort. But hard work or effort doesn't equal suffering.
And okay, right. So you can work hard and put effort into life. It doesn't necessarily mean you're suffering. And it's wrong to assume that hard work and effort are unpleasant, necessarily unpleasant. That's one point you were making. I I also thought if there's someone in your life, if you're a pro suffering kind of person, and there's someone in your life you have resentment towards, you can use the pro suffering idea as a rationalization to hurt them. Like you're giving someone advice, you're giving some information, you want them to get a job, go to school, and you're saying you want to help them. I'm giving you this advice, I'm giving you a kick in the ass, I'm giving you tough love because I want to improve your life. You need to learn about the real world and how hard it is. And I'm not and so you need to suffer in order to make it in life. This person may be secretly wanting that person to suffer because they resent for whatever reason for resentment, which can have many sources. So there can be a, a bait and switch here. I'm thinking it very much in the moment. Hopefully, where the bait is, I'm gonna try to sell someone on doing X, Y, Z to improve their life, and the switch is I secretly want them to suffer because the advice I'm giving them, the tough love I'm giving them, will confer upon them an indeterminate amount of suffering. But I'll say the point of the suffering is your happiness. It's just that you secretly don't care that much about their happiness or their pleasure or their ease. You just want them to suffer, and you're selling it by saying it'll make you happy.
Bach, I don't know who you spend time with on your weekends, but
Uh,
so
Good question.
right. Um, yes, that would be a bait and switch, and yes, I'm sure there are people who exist in this world who might do that. We usually end up sending the Department of Child Welfare after them. Like that's just usually that's not going to be
Oh,
in line. Um,
well, I wasn't thinking that extreme of not like physical abuse, overt, extreme emotional abuse. Let me let
Sure.
you
And
talk.
what I'm saying is this idea that people would say, "Hey, I'm gonna, I'm gonna tell you one thing and secretly hold another. Like I'm gonna tell you, pursue your happiness, but you have to do that with suffering." Is there people who do that for sure? I'm not gonna disagree with that. It seems to me though that more people would struggle with the fact that like your first examples of, well, what do we do with the fact that suffering happens? So heart attacks happen, natural disasters happen. People do really ungood thing, not good things to other people. They use force and coercion and oftentimes at the end of a weapon. So like, what do we say when people are having to face that kind of suffering? And this idea that you mentioned that people would say at the end of say that, go, oh, that was the best thing that happened to me because it forced me in some way to grow up or become different or become a better person. I think that's where we might find some common ground in terms of whether or not that is in people's best interest to think in that way, right? Like, so
Yeah.
to read all the books where people have said, oh, I had this suffering and I've overcome and now I'm a better person, as opposed to, oh, I had this suffering, I've overcome, I've learned some things. And with the learning, I now realize I can live my life this way and that's better.
Right. Yeah. So it feels like there's, as usual, way too many topics to choose. Um, I think many people who suffer and then become happier later and attribute their happiness. I want to restart. In many cases, people who tend to distrust happy, positive talk and to be attracted to pro suffering kind of life is a burden, learn how to suffer models, people who gravitate towards that, that's actually their way of feeling better because positivity and pleasure and happiness are too offensive currently or in a certain mood or in a certain moment. And what feels better in a certain moment is to expose yourself to lectures and videos on the value of suffering, and that resonates and makes you feel better. I for before our talk right now, I've been watching YouTube videos on screenwriting, and there's a lot of advice, and then one piece of advice that I just listened to like 5 minutes before we went on was you have to write from your core wounds. Everyone writes from their core wounds. And so oh yeah, that's very real. I am my core wounds, and that's the genesis of all great art. And so that's the path to focus on the wounds, not happy, positive, easy, confetti, cotton candy fluff. And I would say then that's what feels better. So
Yeah,
it's not,
interesting.
yeah, okay,
This example feels a little bit more
okay.
to home, what I think is probably lands for people, in the sense that that idea, right from your wounds, feel your pain. If you don't feel pain, you don't create good art. Um, I think is a very common belief system. And I mean, I remember in my own experience going through reading a particular author who came from a similar tradition that I did. And really, when I got out of that book and because I was going through suffering, I read this person's suffering and that's good. And this is what we have to happen. And this is how we learn and grow. And there was a certain level that was like, oh yeah, that felt a little bit good because it kind of almost in a sense validated my experience.
Hmm.
But the other side of it is in many ways it didn't feel good because then that's suggesting, well, I have to keep having more of this. Like if that's how I end up becoming a better person, well, then I need more of what I'm feeling, which is horrible, and that doesn't make sense. And so there was actually an internal contradiction until a year or two later, I'm like, that's ridiculous, those ideas. The idea that I have to suffer in order to become a better person was, to me, it was just like, of course not. Like, why not become a
Oh,
better person by seeking out that which creates a feeling of goodness, right? And that might be, in some cases, helping people. Like, there's nothing wrong with if you find that helping somebody in a certain situation helps you feel good, great, go for it. But that's different than suffering.
the the advice of writing from the core wound is one example that came to mind that I just shared with you. Another that comes to mind in the immediate moment is some time ago, I was watching. So there was a woman whose son died from being hit by a drunk driver, and she goes around and gives talks about. Uh, she's fighting against drunk driving, drinking while driving, and she recites the story of how her son was killed in a car accident, and you can see her getting extremely worked up, total fight flight, like very just agitated. And I was saying that, so she goes around the country just re-triggering herself all the time, giving the next talk, next talk, next talk, and then just stuck in. And she might say, "But this is me. This is the right way. I'm. This is mud to lotus. Life is about suffering, and this gives my life meaning. And I'm better for doing this. I'm just to stay with my suffering, and that's how I'm offering to the world these values."
Mm. Sounds painful.
Sounds painful.
Two, the question is, could there maybe be a better way?
Hmm.
And so it's possible through um, cajoling or trying to get people to feel the same pain that she feels, to get them to begin to make different decisions or to get laws changed. And in a sense, that's like using a form of, say, punishment, right? To get people to, so if she tells her story and there's somebody who's driven drunk themselves and they hear that story and then they feel all kinds of pain or guilt, that's a form of punishment to get them to motivate them to change their behavior. And it does work on some level, but it's not the better way. Like the better way would
Yeah.
be to help people in general, let's say working with people who have had convictions of drunk driving and go, okay, is this good for you? Are you enjoying your life? Like let's help you enjoy things and begin little by
Uh,
little the whole positive reinforcement idea of you have a little bit of a good experience and then you feel good about it. And then you have a little bit more good experience and feel good about that. The likelihood of a person like that drinking and driving is going to be much lower than if you try to use punishment. So this idea that you have to suffer is also very linked to the idea that punishment is the best way to change behavior.
yeah, and the idea is coming up that if a person is suffers a lot and their attentional orientation is towards suffering, I think they will just tend to spread that to other people. Subtly, subconsciously, in nuanced ways, just kind of prime and encourage the feeling of suffering in other people, and to organize conversations around suffering and feelings around suffering. And it just seems like, yeah, suffering can be an addiction that just spreads like a pandemic.
Right? Like
Uh,
somehow when a person has experienced legitimate suffering, so the loss of a son, the loss of your health, like to be bullied or abused, like that's legitimate suffering, of course. And there can be a tendency to want to keep talking about it in a sense to validate your own suffering and say, yep, I should feel bad. Yep, I should feel bad. Yep, this is horrible. And here, this is why. And the fact that we all suffer and therefore we need to pay attention to our suffering because, well, the speaker is really saying, because I need to pay attention to all of this thing that doesn't feel good for me. But that's not the only way to get through suffering.
right, right. Um, what we're trying to sell is, or well, I don't need not speak for you. What I'm trying to sell is that happiness makes you a better person. And that can be a tough sell. First, you have to be sold on an idea that happiness is a noble purpose. And second, you have to be sold on the idea that the way to pursue happiness is to feel happy, which seems to me very logical and straightforward. At the same time, there are a lot of wins in favor of the well, you have to suffer.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think many people have the view that happiness and pleasure are not deep. They're unimportant. Enjoying a hamburger, enjoying the beach, taking a walk, watching a show I like, laughing with a friend. For many people, I suspect they find it. I feel like I'm just repeating our last week. I apologize if I'm doing so, but it feels real right now. So it's just not very meaningful. What's important is my need to look at the latest death toll from the war in Ukraine and to see how much suffering is out there. That's what's real and important in life, not cotton candy. And if you're focused on cotton candy, you're in the wrong way. And I'm saying that's the right way, cotton candy, because then you're getting a taste of non-suffering.
Yeah, and it's
Sugar
very
aside.
difficult. Yeah, it's very difficult for people to allow themselves to feel any level of pleasure, which would lead you in the direction of ultimate long-term happiness. It's hard to do that when you know other people are suffering. And immediately what tends to come up is that how can I be enjoying life when others are suffering? And so it's not legitimate. It's, guilt of some kind, survivor
Yeah,
guilt,
yeah,
or
yeah.
somehow we're not in that very difficult situation. Therefore, to be happy at their expense. Yeah, I remember thinking about this first when I read the book Sophie's Choice. And in there is a character, a young man, who's trying to decide whether to go off to war. He's actually too young, but he really wants to. And it contrasts his experience. And one of the crux in his experience was when he was hungry and he went and bought a bag of bananas. And he sat on the stoop, if I remember correctly, and he's eating these bananas, going, "How can I enjoy these bananas when people are making, in this book, Sophie's choice, which was which of her children to let go into the concentration camps." That's a very basic summary, but that idea that there was somebody else suffering around the world, that he knew about it, and he wasn't allowed to enjoy his bananas. And that struck me at the time because, well, that's kind of how I felt. I was a college student, and so knowing that apartheid was happening in South Africa and Namibia and Angola and Mozambique and what was happening in that region, because that was my era in terms of what was happening in my college life, and it's like, am I allowed to enjoy something? And so not only the idea of can you become a better person? Because obviously, if other people are suffering and I'm not allowed to enjoy happiness when others are suffering, then that can't be leading me to become a better person. Like that was just the logical conclusion of that. And so I
Yeah.
have a feeling that many people are in that similar situation because, well, there is a lot of suffering that goes on. And the question is, can we continue to pursue our own well-being, our own happiness, our own enjoyment, in spite of the fact that somewhere somebody in the world is suffering?
There are there are cultures in which the more a widow cries and suffers after her husband's death, the more moral and noble she's regarded, and she regards herself. And I think a good test for people to think about, a thought experiment, is does it make the widow a better person to suffer longer and cry more and suffer after her husband's death, or to pursue pleasure? And would there be an instinct to shame her if she pursues happiness or is happy sooner rather than later? I think that's a good thought experiment to have for oneself, to examine one's relationship to suffering and happiness, and one's view of whether suffering makes you a more moral person. You know?
Mhm. Right. And one can even go, is that necessary? Like, so I understand, cultures and the pressures of cultures, and if you do not comply to cultural ways of being, but like on just a thought experiment level,
Hmm.
if you allow yourself to, in a sense, wallow. So wallowing would be like, oh, I'm suffering. Yep. Oh, yep. See, I can't, I'm suffering. Oh, yeah, I can't do these things because I'm suffering. So I can't wear colorful clothes. I can't eat food that I want. I can't go to places where I want, because I'm suffering, and I have to do that for 3 weeks, 3 months, 1 year, whatever the prescribed period of time is. And it's like, what if pursuing the pleasure means that you don't feel bad or you feel bad for less long, right? So yes, unpleasant things can happen, but we know that even in the worst of situations, it's possible for people to see, a flower growing or to hear a song and, in the
Hmm.
distance and go, oh yeah. So like there are moments even in the worst of suffering. And, I grew up, some of my first movies for I'm sorry, this is going to tell a lot about me. Some of my first movies were about the Holocaust as a kid, as an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old. I was learned early about that event in history. And I remember very much the little bit, say like the Diary of Anne Frank, and how she's up in this attic and she's looking out and she sees the sun coming in, and how much pleasure she took in that. And in that moment, her suffering is reduced. They're still
Hmm.
suffering because she's still not free, but just that little bit, she was able to enjoy that. And for that moment in her life, there was something pleasurable. And there's story after story of that kind of thing where people found these little bits of pleasure that were there, and that's what sustained them. That's what allowed them to continue in the face of, obstacles that they had less capacity to do something about. And that can be somewhat questioned because there are people who did fight against it and ran away and those kind of things, but there are very few lucky ones. And so there is something about, even in the midst of suffering, that what really is going to make you a better person is and manage the awful situation you're in, is to keep looking for, oh, the warmth of the tea and the sound of the bird and the,
Hmm.
in those moments, those are not small things.
I have a question, Rena.
Okay.
Children are encouraged and exposed to watch stories of suffering, Holocaust, death camps, and shows where people are killed, and that's regarded as important for you to learn about, and it's regarded as wrong to expose children to people having sex, to pleasure, to people giving each other deep pleasure. But people inflicting on each other a lot of suffering, it's thought, well, that's good for children's education. But pleasure, that's terrifying. My question may not be a great one, but do you have anything? Do you have any thought there? The question is, why are children encouraged to immerse themselves in suffering but not pleasure? In the examples I just gave, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because I just had this conversation on a bus
Hmm.
with, as we were going to go hang out in some cenotes, and there's a couple there. I have no idea why this came up, but we both ended up talking about books that we read as kids in school. And so both of us talked about, in, I don't know, fifth or sixth grade, reading a book called The Game. And it's about a guy who's literally hunting another guy who is his prey, right? And I remember at 10, 11 years old, whatever it was, I'm like, why am I reading this story? This is horrible. This doesn't make, why is this part of our education system? I was very clear that that was nuts, that I'm being exposed and made to read this story that
Hmm.
to me is just evil, right?
Hmm.
And I read books like The Diary of Anne Frank, or I read about the Holocaust. I didn't see as much, although I remember there was a key movie that I saw. And was that age appropriate? As a kid, that's, I don't know. But it brings to mind the whole question is like, is it, do we expose kids to things that we, even if we believe it's happening, so even if we believe that the world is on the precipice and the tipping point of environmental doom, is that something that we want to keep pushing on to kids? Because how are they ever going to develop the structures that, even if that were considered to be true, would be able to do something about it? Right? Like, so to constantly expose people to suffering just causes people to become more um, placated towards suffering. And you can see that in whole populations. where, I was just talking with somebody I know is, familiar with, Baltic Eastern European countries, and the toleration of suffering as opposed to rising up and saying, no, we're not going to do this. There's literally this ease of tolerating suffering, and that's been taught to them since they were little kids. So I actually think it's a really legitimate question, because I think whole cultures are based on what you just asked, exposing kids to the unpleasantness of life. As far as pleasure, right? Like there that yes, should be exposed to pleasure, absolutely. Is there what, how does one culture decide from another culture when's the time to do that? Some cultures it's just out in the open. Matter of fact, in medieval cultures there's less privacy in general, and so everybody knew about people engaged in sexual pleasure. um just and so, but
Yeah.
as that piece has become more private, it also is connected to more shame, and so therefore there's a less likelihood of people showing that. But even so, even without that one, there's all these other lower orders of pleasure that seems to me it would be much better for developing children to expose them to that, and to expose them to what's possible, right? So pursuit of
Yeah.
pleasure is the pursuit of what's possible. The pursuit of happiness is what's possible, and encouraging the development of that.
I think, to the people who say, well, my suffering in life was really important because I grew from it. I got wisdom and maturity and life experience and strength. I think I think I would say to them, I believe you. And or granting that all that for the sake of argument, I don't think that means you should aim at suffering. And if you rewind time and you were able to gain that knowledge and wisdom without suffering as much, that would have been better. So yes, suffering can happen to you. You can grow from it. Take it. Take whatever wins come your way. And it's not that you should aim at it, right? And the growth is the growth in the ability to orient towards happiness rather than suffering. So there's just this happiness should be the magnet. You know, I'm
Yeah, we might want to talk about that further in
yeah.
another conversation. To like, when you say happiness is the magnet, what are you really meaning? Because I
Yeah.
think so often people misunderstand. Part of the challenge is a misunderstanding of what happiness means, and a misunderstanding of what suffering means, literally in the words. And so, that leads to all kinds of confusion that has.
Yes. And I didn't define either term in our chat. Right. What exactly do we mean by suffering? What exactly do we mean by, yeah, right. Infinite. Um, I brought us a little over time, and thank you for this. Just I find these free association conversations unpredictable, and they can be challenging, a little scare, exciting, nervous, not suffering though, not suffering. You know,
Right. Yeah, there's no doubt. Like, and I feel that too, because we're thinking and talking off the cuff. And,
right? Yeah.
there's ways that we might rewind this and go, okay, maybe I could have said that different or better. But I think the essence of what we're getting at is to encourage the ongoing pursuit of pleasure, and to discourage ideas that suffering is the way to having a better life.
Yes, agreed on that, and agreed on the coolness of our being vulnerable in free association, and we just speak in the moment. And a philosopher that we both respect, Onkar Ghate, he once said, "It's nervous speaking in public in real time," and he says that half of what you say is wrong.
Right.
So when he said that, it made me feel a lot more liberated.
I agree with that, and that's the great joy of learning, because as we talk, we get to hear ourselves again, and it comes
Right.
back to us,
Right.
and now we're going, do I really think that? Do I really believe that? And where have I not been clear in what I'm presenting? So, yep,
And on
totally
the
with you.
positive side, half of what we say is right. Yes. Okay.
And
I
let's aim for that.
okay. Well, I will see you next week for more 50
Sounds
50.
great, Bach.
Okay.
Good to talk to you today.